July 9th, 1968. After Bumpy Johnson's funeral, investigators expected blood but found fear instead. The mafia froze, the streets held back, and whispers spread about $50 million missing. A decade later, federal agents admitted they had passed the money standing less than 3 meters from it. How did Harlem's most hunted fortune stay invisible for 10 years? The apartment at 409 Edgecombe Avenue was inspected the morning after Bumpy Johnson's funeral, and it raised an immediate problem. It did not resemble the home of a man who had controlled Harlem's criminal order for more than 40 years. There were no guards, no locked rooms, and no visible assets that matched his reputation. By midday, every group with a reason to be present had already left. The Italian crews withdrew first quietly and without asserting claims, an unusual response after the death of a power broker. Nicky Barnes' people followed equally restrained, declining to treat the apartment as contested ground. No one behaved like there was anything here worth fighting over. That reaction mattered. In Harlem, violence usually follows uncertainty, not clarity. The absence of conflict suggested a shared conclusion: the apartment did not contain the answer anyone was looking for. Whatever Bumpy Johnson had left behind, it was not visible. Inside, the space offered no contradiction. The furniture was modest and worn by use rather than neglect, and nothing suggested hurried concealment. There were no safes hidden in walls, no reinforced doors, and no signs of panic. The apartment looked exactly as it had been intended to look. Bumpy Johnson's lifestyle had long supported that impression. He drove ordinary cars, wore tailored but unremarkable suits, and lived without visible excess. He did not behave like a man attempting to hide wealth, nor like one eager to display it. That consistency made the lack of evidence harder to dismiss. Official financial records deepened the problem rather than resolving it. Bank statements later reviewed showed balances hovering around $50,000, a figure that stood in sharp contrast to Bumpy's influence. For a man who negotiated with the mafia-mediated disputes and enforced boundaries across Harlem, the number was implausible. It suggested that something fundamental was missing from the record. There were only two explanations that made sense. Either Bumpy Johnson had been quietly stripped of his wealth over time, or he had never allowed his wealth to touch institutions that could document it. Those who had dealt with him understood which explanation aligned with his survival. A man does not last 4 decades in Harlem by trusting paperwork. Frank Lucas did not leave with the others. He remained after the hallway cleared and the doors stopped opening, treating the apartment less like a scene to be searched and more like a statement to be read. He did not rush, and he did not begin dismantling anything. Frank understood that haste would only confirm what others had already assumed. He moved through the rooms, deliberately confirming absences rather than looking for surprises. There was nothing misplaced, nothing careless, and nothing that suggested fear of discovery. The apartment did not resist inspection because it had never been designed to hide anything. That realization sharpened the central question instead of answering it. Frank knew the numbers did not work. He also knew Bumpy Johnson was not careless with power. 3 months earlier, there had been a private conversation between them, one that did not feel significant at the time but refused to fade afterward. Now standing alone in the apartment, that memory pressed forward. The bedroom offered no contradiction to the pattern. The bed was neatly made, the drawers organized, and the walls undisturbed. There were no hidden compartments, no loose boards, and no signs of urgency. Men who fear discovery leave evidence. Bumpy Johnson had left none. That absence mattered more than any missing cash. If the money was not here, not in the bank, and not traceable through records, then it had been placed somewhere intentionally. The location would not be sentimental or symbolic. It would be practical, controlled, and insulated from curiosity. Frank returned to the living room and looked out over Harlem. The streets had resumed their usual noise as if the previous day's silence had never occurred. But no one had rushed to claim Bumpy's position and no boundaries had been tested. That restraint suggested unresolved authority rather than its absence. A true power vacuum creates chaos. This one created discipline. No one moved because no one was certain where the real center of gravity still existed. That kind of hesitation does not follow a man who died broke. Frank adjusted his coat and prepared to leave. The apartment had answered only one question, and it was not the one most people had asked. Bumpy Johnson had not left his fortune where anyone expected to find it. As Frank closed the door, the problem remained intact. If the money was not here, then it had been hidden on purpose, and whoever found it would not be searching loudly. 3 months before his death, Bumpy Johnson asked Frank Lucas to come by late after Harlem had settled into its quieter hours. There was no meeting scheduled on paper, no driver waiting downstairs, and no one else invited. According to accounts Frank would later give, the request came without urgency, which in Bumpy's world often meant the opposite. The apartment was lit sparsely that night. Bumpy sat near the window looking out over Harlem rather than at Frank, a posture he used when he did not want to be interrupted. No one recorded the conversation and no witness ever confirmed it. What is known comes entirely from Frank's recollection shared years later after the consequences had already unfolded. Bumpy did not begin with money. He spoke instead about longevity, about men who burned brightly and disappeared, and about others who lasted long enough to be forgotten while still alive. According to Frank, Bumpy's voice was calm, almost instructional, as if the lesson mattered more than the listener. Nothing in his tone suggested nostalgia or regret. At some point, Bumpy asked Frank a question that did not sound rhetorical. He wanted to know what separated a smart gangster from a dead one. Frank answered cautiously, expecting the usual responses about loyalty or caution. Bumpy shook his head, according to Frank, and dismissed those ideas without explanation. Bumpy's answer was simpler and colder. A smart gangster, he said, never allows anyone to know how much money he really has. Not the government, not his partners, and not even his family. The moment people believe they know your wealth, he explained, they begin calculating how to take it. That principle, Frank later said, was delivered without emphasis. Bumpy did not frame it as advice so much as a rule that already existed regardless of whether anyone followed it. He spoke as if violations were punished automatically without intention or malice. Money in that context was less a reward than a liability. It was only after establishing that rule that Bumpy introduced the figure. He did not dramatize it or pause for effect. According to Frank, he said the number as if it were already settled $50 million in cash. No bank accounts, no ledgers, and no intermediaries. Frank would later say that the number stunned him, not because it sounded impossible, but because it explained too much. It explained the restraint, the discipline, and the refusal to live loudly. It explained why Bumpy never appeared concerned with seizures or audits. The number aligned with the behavior. Bumpy did not specify where the money was. He did not outline a plan or offer instructions. Instead, he framed the money as a test rather than an inheritance. According to Frank, Bumpy made it clear that the money would not be handed over even after death. If something happened to him, Bumpy said the money would go only to someone who understood how to protect it. Not someone who wanted it, and not someone who expected it. The distinction mattered because desire was easy to detect and easy to exploit. That condition changed the nature of the conversation. The money was no longer an asset waiting to be claimed. It became a measure of judgment, patience, and restraint. Whoever found it would have proven they could think the way Bumpy thought. Frank asked how he was supposed to find it. According to his account, Bumpy did not answer directly. He looked back out the window and reminded Frank that obvious questions rarely led to useful answers. If Frank could not figure it out, Bumpy said then he was not the right person to have it. There was no further discussion. The conversation did not end with reassurance or clarity. Frank left that night with no map, no hint, and no promise beyond the implication that the money existed. At the time, he did not treat the exchange as final. Only later did its weight become apparent. After the funeral, after the empty apartment, and after the records failed to reflect the life Bumpy had lived, the conversation resurfaced with new urgency. The absence of instructions no longer felt like omission. It felt deliberate. From an investigative standpoint, the account presents obvious limitations. There is no independent confirmation, no contemporaneous record, and no corroborating witness. But the logic of the conversation aligns with what followed, particularly the absence of conflict and the discipline that settled over Harlem after Bumpy's death. If Bumpy had intended the money to function as leverage, he succeeded. No one rushed to claim it, and no one behaved as if it were accessible. That restraint suggests the money was insulated from impulsive action, just as Bumpy had intended. More importantly, the conversation reframed the search entirely. The question was no longer who deserved the money, but who could find it without revealing themselves in the process. That requirement eliminated most contenders before they began. Frank understood that distinction only after the funeral. Standing alone in the apartment weeks later, the conversation no longer sounded theoretical. It sounded like preparation. The money, if it existed, had been positioned to outlast Bumpy's name. What Bumpy offered that night was not wealth. It was a standard, The money was merely the instrument used to measure whether someone could meet it. In that sense, the conversation was less about succession than survival. If Frank wanted the money, he would have to prove he could protect it without being seen. And if he failed, the money would remain where it was untouched, doing exactly what Bumpy designed it to do. Frank Lucas began with the apartment not because he expected to find the money there, but because he needed to confirm what was not true. He worked methodically, lifting paintings, tapping walls, and examining floorboards for inconsistencies. Nothing sounded hollow, nothing shifted under pressure, and nothing suggested a concealed space waiting to be opened. He moved through the furniture with the same restraint. Drawers were emptied, cushions removed, and the undersides of tables inspected for false panels. There was no safe hidden behind wood, no compartment built into habit, and no sign that the apartment had ever been used as storage. The space resisted nothing because it had nothing to hide. That absence forced Frank to widen the search. If Bumpy Johnson had hidden $50 million, it would not be in a place that could be dismantled in hours. Frank turned to the properties Bumpy owned across Harlem, assets that had always been public but rarely examined closely. There were 17 buildings spread across neighborhoods Bumpy had controlled for years. The search became routine and relentless. Basements were cleared, storage rooms emptied, and ceilings examined for access points that did not belong. Walls were tapped for false construction, and old blueprints were compared against what stood in front of him. Each building offered the same result structure without surprise. Days passed without progress. Frank worked through attics filled with dust and basements that smelled of damp concrete and neglect. He pulled up sections of old flooring, examined support beams, and checked behind patched walls that looked newer than the rest. Every promising detail collapsed under inspection. After a week, frustration replaced expectation. The buildings were clean in the way only long-held properties could be clean-shaped by years of maintenance rather than concealment. If money had ever passed through these spaces, it had not stayed. That conclusion was consistent enough to become disturbing. 2 weeks into the search, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every location Frank checked reflected the same philosophy he had seen in the apartment restraint order and no evidence of panic. There were no rushed modifications, no hidden chambers built in haste, and no mistakes left behind. The absence felt uniform. That uniformity raised a different question. Hiding $50 million required planning, but it also required risk. Large sums demanded space access and protection. Yet none of Bumpy's properties showed signs of being adapted for that purpose. Frank began to recognize the flaw in his approach. He was searching like law enforcement trained to look for hidden spaces, secret compartments, and physical irregularities. He was assuming that money had to be buried sealed or disguised structurally. That assumption guided every failed search. Bumpy Johnson, however, had never thought like the police. He had survived them by anticipating their instincts and staying one step ahead. If Bumpy had hidden the money, he would have chosen a method that did not trigger suspicion in the first place. Frank realized he was looking for secrecy when he should have been looking for indifference. That realization shifted the pressure. The problem was no longer that Frank could not find the money. It was that he had been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking where someone would hide $50 million, he needed to ask where no one would think to look. The search paused, not because Frank had given up, but because he needed to reset his logic. The absence across 17 properties was not failure. It was instruction. Bumpy had not hidden the money behind walls or under floors. He had removed it from the category of things people searched for. Frank returned to the apartment one last time and stood still. The rooms no longer felt empty. They felt instructive. Everything Bumpy had owned openly had been clean, documented, and predictable. That consistency was not accidental. By the end of the second week, Frank accepted what the search had revealed. He had not missed the money. He had been deliberately guided away from it by his own assumptions. The mistake was not where he looked, but how he thought. Frank had been searching like a cop. Bumpy Johnson had never hidden anything like a criminal afraid of being caught. Whatever held $50 million was not buried locked away or disguised as something secret. It was somewhere ordinary, stable, and protected by the simple fact that no one questioned it. And until Frank learned to think that way, the money would remain exactly where Bumpy intended it to stay. The breakthrough did not arrive as a revelation. It came as an irritation, the kind that follows weeks of disciplined failure. Frank Lucas understood by then that the problem was not access or effort, but assumption. He had been searching for secrecy when Bumpy Johnson had built his life around predictability. Frank began replaying fragments of conversations he had once ignored. Bumpy had never spoken in riddles, but he often stated rules without context, leaving others to learn their meaning later. One phrase returned with unusual persistence: the best place to hide something valuable is where no one thinks to search. At the time, it had sounded like philosophy rather than instruction. That principle contradicted how most men behaved under pressure. People hid things where discovery felt least likely: behind walls, under floors, inside locked spaces that announced their importance. Law enforcement searched those places first because criminals relied on them. Bumpy, however, had survived by anticipating that logic and refusing to follow it. Frank realized he had been mirroring police instincts rather than Bumpy's. He had assumed the money would be concealed, physically disguised, structurally, or buried behind effort. That assumption was convenient, but it was also predictable. Predictability was exactly what Bumpy avoided. The question shifted accordingly. It was no longer where someone would hide $50 million, but where Bumpy would place it so that no one questioned its presence. The answer had to be a place that invited indifference rather than scrutiny. A location so ordinary, so accepted, that attention never lingered. Frank listed everything Bumpy owned openly: apartments, buildings, businesses, and properties that existed on paper and in public view. Most of them had already been searched either by Frank himself or by people who assumed they mattered. That process eliminated anything that inspired curiosity. What remained were assets that carried legitimacy as armor. Places that operated within the community served a function beyond profit and discouraged investigation through custom rather than security. Frank recognized that Bumpy valued institutions that blended into daily life without attracting authority. One business returned to his thoughts repeatedly, not because it seemed promising, but because it had never seemed suspicious. The Renaissance Funeral Home on 125th Street had been part of Harlem's landscape for years. Everyone knew Bumpy owned it, and no one questioned why. The funeral home did not behave like a front. It served families, handled burials, and operated with a quiet professionalism that matched its purpose. It was spoken of with respect rather than fear, which insulated it from rumor. Even rivals treated it as neutral ground. Frank considered what the funeral home represented: death, dignity, and closure. A place people entered quietly and left without questions. It was not associated with transaction, storage, or secrecy. That absence of association made it invisible in a different way. From an investigative perspective, funeral homes rarely ranked as targets. They dealt with regulated processes, visible schedules, and community trust. Law enforcement focused on businesses that moved money, not bodies. That distinction mattered more than Frank had initially understood. Frank recalled Bumpy's interest in respect over profit. The funeral home had never been about revenue alone. It offered something more: durable legitimacy within the community and moral insulation from scrutiny. That combination made it valuable beyond its balance sheet. The idea unsettled Frank because it simplified the problem too much. Hiding $50 million in a place everyone knew about felt reckless, but Bumpy's success had always relied on rejecting instincts that felt safe to others. What appeared reckless was often calculated. Frank tested the idea against Bumpy's habits. Bumpy trusted systems that discouraged curiosity without enforcement. He preferred spaces governed by etiquette rather than locks. The funeral home fit that model precisely. More importantly, death itself discouraged inspection. People avoided lingering, avoided touching, avoided questioning. Even authorities approached such spaces with procedural caution rather than suspicion. That hesitation created gaps larger than any hidden compartment. Frank understood then that plain sight did not mean visibility. It meant normalcy. It meant placing something valuable inside a setting so ordinary, so socially protected that searching it felt inappropriate. The money would not need walls or safes if human behavior did the work. The Renaissance Funeral Home embodied that logic. It was public, respected, and routine. Families came and went, paperwork moved quietly, and nothing about the operation suggested risk. Even if someone suspected something, the cost of being wrong felt too high. Frank drove past the building several times without stopping. He watched how people entered, how they left, and how the space controlled behavior without force. There were no guards, no secrecy, and no urgency. Everything about it discouraged inspection. The realization did not bring relief. It brought pressure. If the money was there, it had been there the entire time, untouched and unchallenged. That meant Bumpy's design had worked perfectly, even in death. Frank did not act immediately. He understood that certainty mattered more than speed. Bumpy had designed the test to punish impatience as much as ignorance. The answer once seen could not be unseen. By the end of that day, the search had changed form. Frank was no longer hunting hidden spaces. He was preparing to confirm a conclusion that relied on behavior rather than architecture. The problem was no longer where to look, but whether he was ready to look the way Bumpy intended. If the money was hidden in plain sight, then secrecy was never the point. The point was understanding which places people refused to question. And if Frank was right, the most valuable asset Bumpy had ever owned was the one no one had ever bothered to doubt. The funeral home remained exactly where it had always been. Quiet, respected, untouched. Frank Lucas returned to the Renaissance funeral home just after midnight when the street had thinned and the building blended into the quiet routines of the block. He did not force entry or hurry inside. He used an old key one that still fit because no one had ever thought to change the lock. That detail mattered more than he expected. Inside, the air shifted immediately. The warmth of Harlem disappeared, replaced by cold and chemical sterility. The smell of embalming fluid lingered in the corridors, sharp enough to register but familiar enough to be ignored. The building did not resist him. It accepted him the way it accepted everyone else. Frank moved past the viewing rooms first. Rows of polished caskets sat under dim lights closed and orderly, each one a finished statement. Flowers had been cleared and the space felt neutral again, stripped of ceremony. Nothing here invited curiosity. The preparation rooms were quieter. Stainless steel surfaces reflected light without warmth, and the floors carried the faint residue of routine work. This was a place governed by procedure, not secrecy. Everything visible belonged exactly where it was supposed to be. The freezer door stood at the end of the hall. It was industrial, heavy, and unremarkable, the kind of fixture no one questioned once its purpose was understood. Frank paused before opening it, not out of fear but calculation. If he was wrong, this was where the theory would collapse completely. When he opened the door, the cold came forward in a controlled rush. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply and the space revealed itself without drama. Metal racks lined the walls and 6 gurneys rested in the center, each one covered with a white sheet pulled tight at the edges. Frank did not move immediately. The freezer was quiet in a way that discouraged movement, a space designed to slow behavior. He understood then that the design itself was part of the concealment. Everything about the room discouraged unnecessary inspection. He approached the first gurney and lifted the sheet carefully. Beneath it lay a body elderly still and unmistakably real. There was no ambiguity, no need for closer examination. Frank replaced the sheet and moved on without comment. The second gurney held the same answer. Another body, different features, different weight, but equally undeniable. The third confirmed the pattern. Death properly stored exactly where it belonged. Frank stopped before the fourth. The pause was not emotional, it was procedural. If the theory failed here, it failed entirely. He lifted the sheet. What lay beneath did not resemble a body. It did not slump, breathe, or carry the contours of human form. Instead, it held shape, unnaturally squared and rigid beneath plastic wrapping. Frank pulled the sheet back further. Stacks of cash filled the gurney from end to end. Bundles of $100 bills sealed tightly in plastic, frozen solid, and preserved with care. The money did not look hidden. It looked stored. Frank did not react immediately. He stood still and allowed the image to settle, understanding that the shock mattered less than the implication. This was not concealment driven by fear. It was placement driven by confidence. He checked the remaining gurneys one by one. Each revealed the same construction stacks of cash, arranged carefully wrapped against moisture and frozen to preserve condition. 6 gurneys in total, each carrying approximately $8 million by Frank's estimate. The math aligned without effort. The freezer did not feel like a hiding place. It felt like a ledger. Everything was accounted for, labeled by position rather than by record. The environment did the work that walls and locks usually performed. Frank understood then why the funeral home had never drawn attention. No one searched freezers for money, and no one disturbed bodies without cause. Death itself functioned as the barrier. The money was protected not by secrecy, but by hesitation. The brilliance of the design did not lie in the amount. It lay in the behavior it exploited. People avoided touching the dead, avoided questioning spaces marked by grief, and avoided looking too closely at what made them uncomfortable. Bumpy had relied on that instinct without ever acknowledging it. Frank sat down on the edge of a nearby crate and looked at the gurneys again. The money had been here the entire time, untouched, unchallenged, and perfectly preserved. It had survived Bumpy's death, the withdrawal of rivals, and the beginning of federal curiosity without drawing a single serious glance. This was not a hiding place meant to be temporary. It was designed to outlast attention cycles, rumors, and investigations. Even if authorities entered the building, they would search walls and ledgers, not the bodies waiting to be buried. The freezer was invisible precisely because it was understood. Frank closed the sheets, carefully restoring the room to its original state. Nothing about the space suggested disturbance. The freezer returned to silence as easily as it had surrendered the truth. As he stepped back into the hallway, Frank understood the full scope of Bumpy's test. Finding the money required more than access or persistence. It required the willingness to look where others refused to look and the discipline to leave it untouched once found. The genius of Bumpy Johnson had never been accumulation. It had been placement. He had not hidden money where it was secret. He had placed it where no one questioned its presence. Frank turned off the light and closed the freezer door behind him. The money remained exactly where it had always been protected, not by locks or guards, but by the simple fact that no one dared to check the dead. The tip reached the FBI quietly the way rumors that refuse to die usually do. It claimed that Bumpy Johnson had left behind a hidden fortune, $50 million in cash, unaccounted for and untouched. At first, it sounded like folklore, the kind that followed powerful men into the grave. But the number was specific enough to demand attention. Dennis McCarthy took the call. He had spent years tracking Bumpy Johnson, watching cases stall and witnesses disappear without explanation. According to later records, McCarthy did not react with excitement or skepticism. He reacted with recognition. If the money existed, it explained too much to be ignored. Bumpy's restraint, the lack of visible assets, and the discipline that followed his death all pointed toward something unresolved. McCarthy understood that power rarely vanished without leaving residue. Within weeks, the investigation was formalized. Warrants were drafted, teams assembled, and the search expanded beyond rumor into procedure. McCarthy was assigned lead responsibility not because he was optimistic, but because he was persistent. The first phase followed standard doctrine. Bumpy's residences were searched thoroughly, room by room, wall by wall. Storage units were opened, safes cataloged, and personal effects inventoried. Nothing of value surfaced. The search widened. Warehouses, garages, and secondary properties tied to Bumpy's name were examined in sequence. Financial institutions were subpoenaed, safety deposit boxes reviewed, and associates questioned. The pattern remained consistent: no accounts, no ledgers, no cash. By the end of the first year, the absence itself became the case. Investigators could not prove the money existed, but they could not dismiss it either. Too many indicators pointed toward concealment rather than myth. McCarthy documented the discrepancy carefully. Internal records began to reflect the scale of the effort. More than $600,000 in federal funds were allocated to the investigation, spread across surveillance, manpower, and legal work. 6 agents were assigned full-time, rotating through shifts that produced activity but no resolution. 3 levels of supervision reviewed and approved each expansion of scope. Pressure followed predictably. Supervisors wanted progress, not theories. Other cases competed for resources, and the absence of tangible results began to draw quiet criticism. McCarthy was asked more than once whether he was chasing something real or something personal. He insisted there was a difference. Bumpy Johnson, McCarthy argued, had never behaved like a man without leverage. The money, if hidden, would not appear where anyone expected it. That logic, however, was difficult to translate into warrants. The investigation continued. Associates were re-interviewed, often repeatedly. Family members were questioned not as suspects but as potential repositories of information. None produced leads that survived verification. Every path led back to the same dead end. If the money existed, it was not moving. There were no sudden purchases, no unexplained transfers, and no visible lifestyle changes among those closest to Bumpy. The absence of motion contradicted every assumption about hidden wealth. By the 3rd year, the case had acquired a nickname inside the office: Some called it the whale, a target too large to abandon and too elusive to catch. McCarthy did not discourage the comparison. He understood obsession when he saw it. The difficulty was not lack of effort. It was the rigidity of the search logic. The FBI looked for money the way it always had through accounts transactions and structural concealment. Each failure reinforced the belief that the money, if real, must be buried deeper. What the investigation did not consider was indifference, the possibility that the money was not hidden in secret but placed where secrecy was unnecessary. That idea did not fit any manual McCarthy had been trained to follow. By the 5th year, the case survived largely because it had not been disproven. No document ruled out the existence of the money, and no testimony contradicted it conclusively. The investigation remained open by default rather than momentum. McCarthy's reports grew more detailed and more defensive. Each entry accounted for time, resources, and rationale. He documented every dead end not to justify failure, but to preserve the logic behind it. The pressure intensified. Supervisors asked for timelines. Prosecutors asked for evidence. Colleagues asked whether it was time to move on. McCarthy resisted without making promises. By the 10th year, the investigation had become something else entirely. It was no longer about seizing money. It was about resolving an imbalance that refused to settle. Bumpy Johnson's absence continued to exert influence. McCarthy understood the risk of fixation. He also understood that abandoning the case would not erase the questions it raised. Somewhere in Harlem, something remained untouched by scrutiny, and that fact alone unsettled him. The search did not fail because the FBI lacked authority. It failed because it followed expectation. Every warrant assumed the money behaved like money usually did. Bumpy Johnson's fortune, if it existed, did not behave at all. It stayed still silent and ordinary enough to avoid notice, and as long as the investigation continued to look for secrecy, it would remain blind to normalcy. McCarthy closed another report and filed it away. The numbers still did not add up. The whale remained unseen, and the investigation, for all its reach, had spent 10 years swimming in the wrong direction. In the spring of 1969, the FBI finally approved a full raid on the Renaissance Funeral Home. The decision did not come from confidence but exhaustion. After months of fruitless searches and mounting internal pressure, investigators needed to close doors as much as they needed to open them. Dennis McCarthy led the operation. By then, the funeral home had appeared in the case file repeatedly, never as a suspect location, only as a recurring constant. It was known legitimate and publicly defensible, which made the warrant feel procedural rather than urgent. The raid began shortly after dawn. Agents arrived with trained dogs, structural scanning equipment, and detailed task assignments. Each team had a narrow mandate: confirm, eliminate, move on. There was no expectation of discovery, only the obligation to be thorough. They started where evidence usually surfaced. Offices were stripped methodically, drawers removed, cabinets emptied, and records boxed for later review. Ledgers were checked for anomalies, shell transactions, and unexplained gaps. Everything aligned with a modest, lawful operation. The showroom came next. One by one, caskets were opened and examined. Linings were inspected, seams pressed, and interiors probed for hidden compartments. The work was careful and respectful, yet relentless. Nothing inside the casket suggested anything beyond what they were meant to hold. Basement storage areas followed. Walls were tapped, measurements taken, and radar equipment deployed to detect voids behind concrete. Technicians marked clean readings and moved on. The building offered no resistance because it had nothing structural to conceal. By mid-morning, the search had shifted from possibility to confirmation. Each cleared room reduced the building's relevance in the investigation. The funeral home was becoming, on paper, exactly what it appeared to be. The dogs were brought through next. They moved across the floors, along walls, and through doorways with disciplined precision. Occasional alerts were logged, cross-checked, and dismissed as environmental contamination. No alert led anywhere actionable. The preparation rooms were inspected with equal care. Stainless steel surfaces were checked, drains examined, and storage cabinets emptied. Equipment was inventoried and matched to purchase records. Everything complied with regulation. At the end of the corridor stood the walk-in freezer. It was large, industrial, and entirely unremarkable. Its presence required no explanation. Agents documented the freezer's exterior, confirmed operating temperatures, and reviewed maintenance logs. The door was opened briefly, just long enough to establish contents and conditions. Inside were several gurneys, each covered neatly with white sheets. The scene resolved itself instantly. Bodies awaiting burial explained the space completely. No one questioned the sheets. There was no debate, no hesitation, and no raised voice. Disturbing remains required specific authorization and justification. There was neither. The freezer had fulfilled its expected role. The door was closed. The room was marked inspected. The search continued for hours, ceilings were opened, ducts examined, and plumbing accessed where feasible. By early afternoon, every team reported the same conclusion. Nothing of value had been found. McCarthy reviewed the findings on site. The result was frustrating, but it was defensible. The agents had done exactly what federal procedure required. The building had been exhausted as a possibility. Within weeks, the formal report was drafted. Its language was precise and final. Investigators had found no evidence of concealed assets, no indicators of large-scale cash storage, and no grounds for continued focus on the property. Supervisors signed off without revision. The Renaissance Funeral Home was officially cleared. The timing was exact. The report was finalized only weeks after agents had stood inside the freezer. Only weeks after they had documented the presence of gurney sheets and controlled temperatures. Only weeks after they had turned away. From an institutional perspective, the decision was sound. The FBI had followed protocol-respected boundaries and avoided unnecessary disturbance. There was no procedural failure to cite. From a strategic perspective, it was devastating. The money had not been hidden behind walls beneath floors or inside coffins. It had not required deception locks or structural alteration. It had been placed where procedure itself prevented inspection. Agents had been standing less than 3 meters from nearly $50 million in cash. They had logged the room, verified its function, and closed the door without lifting a single sheet. The money remained untouched. No alarm sounded, no suspicion was recorded. No follow-up was requested. The brilliance of the concealment was not cleverness. It was compliance. The freezer had passed inspection precisely because it behaved as expected. The report circulated briefly, then disappeared into the archive. Resources were redirected. New theories replaced old ones. The case continued, but one of its most critical locations had been eliminated permanently. For the next 10 years, investigators would chase accounts properties and rumors built on that assumption. The funeral home would not be revisited. Those familiar with the file later noted that McCarthy returned to the report more than once. Not because it contained errors, but because it contained none. The mistake was not in what was written, but in what was never done. The investigation had not failed due to incompetence. It had failed due to obedience. The agents had respected the dead too much to question them. Bumpy Johnson had not relied on secrecy. He had relied on certainty. He understood that investigators searched for irregularity, not normalcy. And he placed his fortune where normalcy was guaranteed. When the FBI left the Renaissance Funeral Home that day, the building returned to routine. Families arrived, staff worked, and bodies waited quietly beneath white sheets. The money stayed exactly where it had always been. Frozen, untouched, and officially non-existent. In 1975, the search ended not with a breakthrough, but with an arrest. Frank Lucas was taken into custody after years of surveillance finally converged into a single case. The evidence was substantial, the charges extensive, and the potential sentence final enough to leave no room for bravado. Frank chose cooperation, not as an act of remorse, but as a calculation. He offered names, routes, payments, and structures, details that filled gaps federal agencies had been unable to close for years. The cooperation was methodical, not emotional. During one of the later debriefings, Frank shifted the conversation. He asked whether Dennis McCarthy was still assigned to the Bumpy Johnson investigation. When McCarthy entered the room, Frank did not hedge or test the moment. He went directly to the money. According to official summaries, Frank said the FBI had spent nearly a decade looking for Bumpy Johnson's fortune. He said they had searched the right city, the right buildings, and even the right rooms. What they had failed to do, he explained, was ask the wrong question one last time. McCarthy listened without interruption. When Frank mentioned the funeral home, the room tightened but did not react. When he described the freezer, the gurneys and the sheets, there was no disbelief, only recognition. The details aligned too cleanly to dismiss. Frank did not dramatize the explanation or embellish the discovery. He described the placement as if recounting inventory, not legend. That tone made the confession more damaging than outrage ever could. Warrants were prepared the same day. The return to the Renaissance funeral home was conducted quietly without press or ceremony. This was not an operation meant to demonstrate authority. It was an operation meant to confirm a mistake. The building opened as it always had. The halls were quiet, the equipment unchanged, and the routines uninterrupted. Nothing suggested urgency because nothing had ever needed to. The freezer was approached directly. The door was opened fully this time, not briefly. The gurneys stood where they had always stood. A sheet was pulled back. There was no body beneath it. Only stacks of $100 bills, sealed in plastic, frozen solid, and preserved with care. The next gurney confirmed it. Then the next. 6 in total. The count reached just under $48 million. The figure was smaller than the legend, but large enough to remove any doubt. What had once been rumor was now inventory. Agents documented the seizure with restraint. Photographs were taken, serial numbers logged, and evidence secured. No one celebrated. The confiscation was later recorded as the largest cash seizure in FBI history at the time. The announcement came after the facts stripped of surprise. The victory arrived without applause. For McCarthy, the moment carried no relief. The money had been real, but it had not been found through insight or persistence. It had been found because someone decided to speak. The freezer had not changed in 7 years. The gurneys had not moved. The money had waited, patiently protected by procedure, etiquette, and the certainty that no one would question the dead. Internally, the case was closed as a success. Externally, it was presented as the inevitable conclusion of a long investigation. Privately, it was understood as something else entirely. The FBI had followed every rule. It had respected boundaries, documented absence, and trusted process. And in doing so, it had guaranteed that the truth would remain invisible until someone broke silence. Frank Lucas received a reduced sentence for his cooperation. His empire was dismantled, but his role in the story remained intact. The money, though seized, had already fulfilled its purpose. Bumpy Johnson's design had worked exactly as intended. The fortune survived death scrutiny and time. It fell only when confession replaced discipline. The case closed with paperwork, not clarity. The truth emerged, but it arrived too late to restore confidence in the hunt that had missed it. The freezer door was shut again, empty this time, its lesson already absorbed. The FBI finally found the money. What it never recovered was the certainty that it had ever been in control. 10 years of pursuit, thousands of man-hours, and hundreds of search warrants did not bring the FBI closer to the truth. They did not fail for lack of power, but because they searched only where suspicion told them to look. Bumpy Johnson understood the opposite. Enduring power does not need to be hidden, it needs to be placed where people refuse to question it. He did not hide money in darkness, but in respected silence. Frank Lucas learned that lesson, built an empire on invisible discipline, and lost everything the moment he allowed himself to be seen. The final question is not how clever Bumpy Johnson was, but this: if an entire community survived because of that money, who was the real loser in the end? If this case stayed with you, subscribe for more investigative stories. History never closed properly. These are not episodes. They are cases reopened to expose power, silence, and consequence. Like the video if you watch to the end, and comment below: was Bumpy Johnson a criminal genius or simply the only man who understood the system chasing him?